So welcome to the second presentation on the Central Goldfields Shire budget for the year 23-24. My name is Lucy Roffey and I'm the CEO of Central Goldfields Shire Council. And joining me again today is Philippa Sperling, our Manager of Finance. This session is going to provide more detail about the budget and more technical information about our financial KPIs. If you missed last week's session, it's available on our website to watch anytime. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and extend my appreciation for the Dja Dja Wurrung people, the traditional owners of the land that we are on today. Today we pay our respects to leaders and elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and the hopes of all Dja Dja Wurrung people. We express our gratitude in the sharing of this land, our sorrow for the personal, spiritual and cultural costs of that sharing, and our hope that we may walk forward together in harmony and in the spirit of healing. So today's presentation will answer any questions that we received from last week's presentation. We're also going to talk about the financial KPIs that are recommended by the Victorian Auditor General's Office that measure financial sustainability and viability. So firstly, Philippa, can you give us a recap on what we talked about last week?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. So last week's presentation is up on our Facebook page and on our website Engage section of the budget. So we've made sure it's coming up at the top of the page, so you shouldn't have to go looking for it too hard. So last week we gave a high-level overview of the budget, so what's included and the financial challenges we're facing. We looked at the key elements of the budget, being revenue, expense and capital works, and looked at some of the key projects and initiatives. We looked at government grant funding and which services are partly funded by state and federal government grants. We also had a look at the difficulty Council faces from the compounding impact of rate capping on the long-term financial sustainability of Council operations.
Great, thanks. Great summary, Philippa. So let's firstly move on to answering any of the questions we received to date from that first presentation. I know we've received some questions via our Engage website and also through our media email. The first question we received was in relation to rates. The question was, how is it fair or appropriate that areas outside of Maryborough Township receive higher rate increases than those in Maryborough? So can you explain this to us, Philippa?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two key factors that impact on the calculation of rates. So one is the valuation of the property, and secondly, the rating differential, which is different for different categories of property. So the rate differential for farm properties and for residential properties outside of Maryborough are less than rate differentials for Maryborough residential properties. So if there are two properties of the same value in, say, Talbot and Maryborough, the Talbot property pays less in rates. The second factor is the annual valuation. So the increase in the property values across the Shire and in different property categories can differ. So if the values go up more in Talbot than they do in Maryborough, then it is likely that the ratepays in Talbot will get an overall higher rate increase.
Thanks for that explanation, Philippa. And I think we explain a bit more about rating differentials later in this presentation, so we can go into that again in more detail. Now, the second question we had was, as part of the road spending, I would like to see Malort Road, Carisbrook sealed. It's a small stretch of road and is very busy thoroughfare for many vehicles from Grice Street through to Barringup Road. So, Philippa, I think this probably relates to our road management plan. Can you explain a little bit about this particular issue and why it wouldn't be funded?
Yeah, that's right. So our infrastructure team do an enormous amount of work in assessing the roads throughout the Shire. This includes the review and prioritisation of road rehabilitation and maintenance. Being a small Shire with a small rate base and low growth, we don't generate enough revenue to undertake significant road upgrades such as sealing of roads. The unsealed road network predominantly caters for local traffic movements from main roads to properties, and the need for these roads to be sealed is actually low due to the volumes and nature of the movements each day. So funding would be required to seal unsealed roads, and it is also quite a lot, so fairly significant. And I guess with competing priorities across the Shire, it's not a funded program at this stage.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation, Philippa. The next question we received is in relation to the splash park. I think we talked about that a little bit in last week's presentation. A community member would like to know why the splash park was mentioned in the 21-22 budget, but then has sort of disappeared since then.
So the splash park is something that the community has been advocating for some time. And I guess to be clear, the splash park has not been removed from the budget. So we have included funds for a play space strategy. So the intent of this is to look at our play spaces across the Shire. And as part of this, we aim to identify the most appropriate location for the splash park. So the next step from that would be then to undertake a design for the splash park. The funding for construction of a splash park would also need to come from either state or federal government, and we will be looking for opportunities for this funding once the design is complete.
Great, thanks, Philippa. And again, I think in last week's presentation, we spoke a lot about the types of things that state and federal government fund, and particularly for new assets in the Shire, we always look towards state and federal funding. We're not really generating enough revenue ourselves to do to create new assets. So the next question is around energy breakthrough and its viability for the Shire. The question is, how much does the event generate in Maryborough?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lucy. So the Energy Breakthrough is our flagship event for the Shire. So it takes a monumental amount of organising, both for our staff and volunteers, as well as the schools that do participate. So the net cost to council is approximately $320,000 in next year's budget. However, if we look at the wider community, the economic benefit is between the $4 to $5 million mark.
Great, thanks, Philippa. It is a great event, and a lot of effort goes into it, and it does generate those returns for the broader economic community. The next question specifically relates to the Talbot Museum and plans to repair the building. Can you answer that one for us, Philippa?
Yeah, so the budget does include some repairs to historical buildings across the Shire. So we have asset plans for buildings as well as we do for our roads, and the Talbot Museum will be reviewed as part of the Capital Works program.
Thanks, Philippa. I know a lot of our older buildings most certainly need some care and repair, and we've got quite a few of our town halls also in the budget for next year. The last question asks if we could plant fruit trees throughout the Shire, which will provide a healthier option for residents. And it also asks about the Engage Youth Program, Freezer and LTP programs, and just a bit of an explanation about what they are.
Yeah, sure. So I guess to answer the first part, Council is partnering with other Shire organisations to develop the Central Goldfields Shire Food Network. And one outcome is the development of a food systems network. So potential initiatives around either planting or making better use of existing fruit trees have already been proposed, and they're likely to be included in future action plans. And then on the second part, so the Freezer program supports young people to organise festivals, live music events and cultural workshops for other young people in their local community. And this is funded by the state government. Also funded by the state government is the Engage program, which delivers a range of activities for young Victorians aged 12 to 25. These activities focus on the engagement, development and celebration of our youth. And finally, the L2P program is supporting our learner drivers in progressing through to getting their Ps.
Fantastic. I really want to thank all the community members that submitted those questions. It was really great to get them in advance of this session today. Still opportunity to put in questions through the budget process, and we'll try to answer those in the future by email or by mail, depending on how you put those questions in. So now we're going to move into delving a little bit deeper into the budget, moving on from last week's presentation. So if we're looking at the budget process, can you just update us on where we're at, Philippa?
Yeah, so we're getting towards the end of the budget process now. So community feedback closes on the 9th of June, so this Friday. And following that, I'll be briefing the councillors of any changes to the draft budget or before presenting the budget to council at the June council meeting for adoption.
Thanks, Philippa. So we're going to start looking a bit more into the financial KPIs and how they impact on our long-term planning for financial sustainability. This next slide is an extract from the Victorian Auditor General report on local government finances to 30 June 2022, so at the end of last financial year. We will talk more about the increase in cost versus revenue, but this slide shows the reliance on government funding, and in this case, federal finance assistance grants paid in advance. So what's this telling us, Philippa?
So this is telling us that much of the local government sector would have shown significantly reduced surpluses or even increased deficits if the federal government hadn't brought forward any additional payments. So this is difficult to forecast as decisions are made late in the financial year. And going forward, we still don't have clarity on whether this will happen again this financial year or early in next financial year. So the timing of this payment will actually have an impact on our year-end financial result.
So can you explain that in a bit more detail? So how does it impact our end-of-year financial result?
Well, I guess the good news that we will still be in a strong financial position at the end of the financial year, so regardless of the timing of this payment. So we have made some key decisions around cash flow. So in particular, refinancing our existing loan to ensure that we have a positive working capital ratio. The timing of the payment of the financial assistance grant will have an impact on our operating surplus and underlying deficit though. As this is untied funding, we recognise it in the year that we actually receive it. So when putting the budget together, we do make our best estimate of what we anticipate the federal government and when they will pay this, but it is still an unknown.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Philippa. And I think it's also important for the community to understand this is not an ongoing issue. So if and when the federal government decides to wind back the prepayment, it has a one-year impact. But it's a good insight, Philippa, and important to know that this is a sector-wide issue and not just one for Central Goldfields Shire. So this is looking at another sector-wide challenge. So it's looking at the underlying deficit. Can you explain a little bit about the underlying deficit and why it's important?
Yeah, definitely. So the underlying deficit is a financial measure that looks at the ongoing viability of councils by calculating what the surplus or deficit would be if councils hadn't received any capital grants from government. So this graph shows the financial sustainability gap for local governments across Victoria. So to plot Central Goldfields on this graph, we are a small rural council. So our cohort is probably the most stable when looking at this graph. However, it is still trending down. And I guess what this is really showing us is the constraints that we operate under are pretty similar across the sector. So the compounding impact of rate capping, increasing CPI, as well as the continuous cost shifting are having an impact on the wider sector.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great explanation, Philippa. I think now we're going to move into more details in the budget. So let's start by looking again at rates.
Yeah, so rates account for 41% of our revenue. We talked a lot about this last week and what our rates actually pay for. But if we delve further into our rates, we can see that Maryborough residential properties make up the bulk of what we receive from rates. One of the questions from the community earlier asked about rates for outside of Maryborough and why their rates increase more than the rates for Maryborough properties. Lucy, you have a great analogy you like to use to explain the difference between overall rate increase and the rate increases per property.
Yeah, thanks, Philippa, and I hope this explanation works. One of the questions we get often is why someone's rates have gone up more than the rate cap, and if council therefore gets more money than the rate cap because of that. But actually the rate cap refers to the total amount of rates that council can raise. So if you think about an orange as being the total rates that we raise, we can only grow that orange. So the orange can only get bigger by the rate cap. That is 3.5% in next year's budget. But what happens when we have valuations in each year is that each rate each category of ratepayer may contribute a bigger slice of the orange because the value of their property has gone up more in comparison to another category of ratepayer. This has been happening particularly to the farming properties in the Shire after a number of strong years in agriculture and ever rising property prices. So basically, if the properties go up by, say, 15% in value, and residential properties only go up by 8% in value, then the farming properties are contributing a greater slice of the orange and residential properties less of a contribution. So in that scenario, a farm property will pay greater than the 3.5% rate cap, and the residential properties will be paying less than the 3.5% rate cap, but council still only receives a 3.5% increase in revenue. So hopefully that explains it a little bit, and perhaps why some people get confused why their rates notice may show a greater increase than the rate cap, and others, which we often don't hear from, who may have received even a reduction in their rates because their share of the orange has got smaller.
That's great. Thank you, Lucy.
So getting into the actual differential rate categories, we've got 7 differential rate categories. Can you explain the purpose of these, Philippa, and how they're different?
Yeah, for sure. So differential rating provides councils with the ability to adjust rates to provide equity, taking into consideration things such as access to services, capacity to pay rates, and the ability to deduct rates as a business expense. So the rationale for the differentials are outlined in our rating and revenue strategy, and that can be found on our website. And we regularly review this and update this. One of the factors we do take into account is reducing rate shock. So this is ensuring each differential category does not have an increase of more than 10%. Please keep in mind, though, that this is per category, not per property, as Lucy just spoke to.
Thanks, Philippa. So you love to talk about your tram tracks. Can you explain what do you mean by tram tracks?
Yeah, definitely. So we refer to the tram tracks as a set of financial indicators that are used to guide the decision-making of council to ensure our ongoing financial sustainability. So the financial indicators are measured by Vargo, who outline low, medium and high risk values for these measures to assist councils in managing their financial risk.
So the low and medium and high risk really are the tram tracks, aren't they?
Yes, exactly.
And we've already talked about a couple of the KPIs earlier, but can you just go through some of the other KPIs, Philippa?
Yeah, sure. So there are 7, and we will talk about them in a bit of depth now, but they are net result, adjusted underlying result, liquidity ratio, internal financing, indebtedness, capital replacement ratio, and the renewal gap.
So let's start with the first one, which is net result. You can see the tram tracks there, the red being at the bottom being high risk, all the way through to the green being low risk. What do our results tell us here?
So a positive result here indicates a surplus, and the larger the percentage, the stronger the result. A negative result indicates a deficit. So operating deficits, we can't sustain those over a long term. This shows the impact of capital grants on our net result. So council has been extremely successful in advocating for grants for the Shire to undertake particularly capital works. So the reason this impacts positively on our operating result is that the expenditure for the capital works program is actually sitting in our capital works statement rather than our income statement.
So basically sits on the balance sheet rather than in the P&L.
Yeah, that's right.
So this next one, we're looking at the adjusted underlying result. So the last one was net result, or the result, the profit. This one's called adjusted underlying result. Can you explain how it's different from a net result?
Yeah, definitely. So the adjusted underlying result removes any capital grant funding. So the reason that this is a key financial KPI is that financial grant funding can mask issues of longer term financial sustainability. So capital grants are in most cases not ongoing and therefore provide a short-term boost to the bottom line. But for measuring long-term financial sustainability, we need to look at how we are tracking without these grants. This is the ability to generate a surplus from the ordinary course of business.
And really this graph lines up with what we saw across the sector in that previous graph, a decrease in underlying results and a result of a number of decisions made outside of council, such as the compounding impact of rate capping, as well as cost shifting that we spoke briefly about last week.
Yeah, and I think it's key to note in this graph that the outer years are showing an increase in the underlying result. So as we have said before, we are tasked with managing our finances within our means, and we've built in cost savings into the future.
Thanks, Philippa. So this is another one of the key KPIs, the liquidity ratio. It's also often referred to as a working capital ratio. Why is this measure important?
So it is imperative that we monitor this one closely. So the liquidity ratio measures our ability to meet our short-term financial obligations. I like to use the analogy that imagine you're playing Monopoly and you want to purchase Trafalgar Square. So you need to make sure you have enough money, not only to buy the property, but you need to make it all the way around until you pass go and get your next $200. Now, obviously, we are talking about a much more serious environment, but I guess the process and the thinking is still the same.
Yeah, and in this graph, we can see that our liquidity ratio is above the tram tracks, which means we're operating in a low risk environment. And that was a real focus of our budget to ensure that we retained that. So you also talked about the impact of the federal assistance grants and their timing earlier. I assume that also can have an impact on our liquidity.
Yeah, it does. And whilst we still expect to receive these grants up front, we just don't know if they'll be paid before or after June 30. So to mitigate the chances of a negative liquidity ratio, we've taken steps such as pushing out our loan principal repayments. We've put a note in the draft budget to note our assumptions about the federal assistance grant, but also just, I guess, noting that this is a risk and there could be a different outcome.
So this next measure, the internal financing ratio, this also is having a look at our cash flow.
Yeah, that's right. So we compare the net operating cash flow to the capital expenditure. So this is therefore impacted by capital grants we receive and the timing of those and spending of those funds. So capital projects that are carried forward can have a negative impact on the internal financing ratio as the cash received in one year they're spent in the next, and you can see that in sort of the ups and downs in that graph. However, that is the nature, I guess, of multi-year projects. So it's important to look at it from a long-term perspective. But it's also important to track and maintain good internal financing ratio.
That's right. And then in the out years, we make fairly conservative assumptions as well, don't we?
That's right, yep.
Okay, and now we're looking at debt. So debt is often spoken about negatively, but it has its purpose, particularly for funding. And I note with this one, this is sort of a reverse to the others. So the high risk is at the top and the low risk is the green line at the bottom. And it looks here that our KPI is in the low risk section.
Yeah, definitely. So firstly, it is important to note that, as Lucy said, that VAGO considers anything below 40% as low risk. So our indebtedness ratio is in the low risk zone. The change in the ratio here is the impact of not paying down our principal repayment on our loan. So the loan was previously categorised as a current liability, as it was due to be repaid within 12 months. With refinancing, it is now recategorised again to be a non-current liability, increasing the percentage of indebtedness in the KPI, but improving our working capital ratio in 23-24.
And moving now on to some of the capital replacement ratios. This one refers to how we're able to fund new assets. So can you explain a little bit more about this ratio?
Yeah, that's right. So as a general rule, any new assets need to be either funded or identified in asset plans. And I guess this comes back to the question on Malort Road that we received. This would be considered an upgrade to the asset, which is quite costly. It then requires additional funding in the future to maintain the asset. As you can see from the graph, Council has been very successful in advocacy for the Shire. So while it looks like it drops off in the coming years, it is key to point out that we have been very conservative and only captured the funding we're certain will eventuate. So as we move into those outer years, we will also have a better understanding of what funding is available, and secondly, what we will receive.
So this next KPI is another capital replacement financial KPI. Can you explain a little bit about what this one's showing us?
Yeah, that's right. And this one has actually only been a measure since the 2019-2020 financial year, which is why we don't have that historical data on this graph. But we also have a huge focus on renewing our assets in the last few years. So this includes funding from government, such as the LRCI, which help support council in reducing the renewal gap. So should this funding continue, we would anticipate to see this renewal percentage remain much higher.
So I'll just spell out what LRCI is. It's a Local Roads and Community Infrastructure Fund that came from the federal government. And through that fund, we've been able to do capital work such as upgrading some of our smaller halls around the Shire, some footpaths, and also our swimming pools. So at the moment, all of our swimming pools are getting some investment to upgrade them and so that they can continue on in use for a number of years. And those sorts of projects are really difficult in our current financial scenario without that external grant funding. So last but not least, we talked about the challenge of the rate cap and CPI last week, but I think it's worth discussing again in the context of these financial KPIs that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, definitely. So we did touch on this last week and the ongoing challenge of the growing gap between the rate cap and CPI. So the rate cap represents revenue, or how we fund our 40 services, and the CPI represents the cost of running these services. So if we look at it in the context of our tram tracks, the growing CPI is adding costs to our bottom line. The impact of this impacts our net result and underlying result, as it adds costs into our income statement. Our liquidity ratio is also impacted by the fact that our creditors are growing. So not so much in number of creditors, but the amount owing through increased costs. Our internal financing ratio is impacted as the cost of our capital works program is increasing. Our indebtedness is impacted by the compounding impact of rate capping and our ability to fund our own services. And as Lucy mentioned previously, the cost shifting of services from state and federal governments, coupled with the rate capped environment, makes for a really difficult challenge. As you can imagine, capital replacement ratio and renewal gap are impacted by the increasing cost of projects.
Thanks, Philippa. It's sure has been a challenge balancing the budget. That's why we've had so many workshops with the councillors and worked really hard to come up with a sustainable budget going forward.
Yeah, it really does paint a picture for our Shire and the ability to get things done. And the key takeaway I would like the community to take from this is that these tram tracks form a big part of the guidance for council to make decisions. So decisions are not made lightly. And if you want to see the detail of these tram tracks, these are also in the budget document on pages 45 and 46.
So as we wrap up from today, where to from here?
Okay, so currently we are in the first stages of this timeline in the community feedback stage. So we've had 2 presentations now on the budget, last week being an overview and this week a more in-depth look at the financials and the forecast for the coming few years. So we've covered off on a few questions, but if you still have further questions, please do submit them and we will respond to you. Just make sure you put your details in so we can come back to you. From here, we will consolidate all the feedback together with councillors and prepare a final budget for adoption at the end of June at the council meeting. Then going into next financial year, we will be reporting quarterly for the finance report. Currently, this is prepared monthly. However, it was decided a more appropriate reporting timeframe would be quarterly. So that will be actioned in the coming year.
So just to finish up, here's all the details where people can have their say, and again, put in more questions if you have them. There's our engage part of the website, or you can send an email to media@seagoldshire.vic.gov.au, and obviously both of those are working well because we did receive a number of questions for today and they were all great questions, and again I thank the community for that. I was going to say, and then just to wrap up, so we've, I think submissions close Friday at 5 p.m. So if you get them into us by then, and as I said, Philippa and I'll try and get back to you on all those questions. And hopefully you found these presentations both last week and today informative and have answered all your questions about the budget. So thanks again, Philippa, and we can say goodbye.